yet. We're thrilled to have Amanda Fairbanks with us tonight. Lost Boys of Montauk is her book. It has a much longer title, actually. It's The Lost Boys of Montauk, the true story of the windblown, 4 men who vanished at sea, and the survivors they left behind. Long as that title is, it's very apt, because unlike so many disaster stories, it actually dives deep into an incredible history of these 4 young men, really, women, boys, young men, their families, the grief that their loss caused, and the incredible culture that they come from, which is our culture. It's about our home out here on the East End. And I have found it so moving. I'm not quite done with it. It's one of those books where you're reading it and you're thinking, I don't want this to end. And you slow down, and now it's like, oh wait, it's tonight, and I didn't finish it. So, but I'm still looking forward to the finale. And and I just have a little bit more to go. But it's been so engrossing and extraordinary, beautifully, beautifully researched. And part of the reason for that is that Amanda Fairbanks holds 2 master's degrees in journalism from Columbia. She's an extraordinary writer, and she's written for, sorry for this, but the New York Times, the Boston Globe, the Atlantic, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Columbia Journalism Review, and the East Hampton Star, as well as Huffington Post, I read online. Right. So, and this is quite a roster of accomplishments. And I know that this is going to be a beautiful talk because the book is beautiful. It's deeply beautiful, if you know what I mean. It takes chances, it dives deep, it makes you uncomfortable, and it's very revealing. And then there's the perk of reading about, say, Ditch Plains, and you're like, well, I was there. So it's the extraordinary familiarity, but the parallel lives of the people that are in this book to many of us in this audience, let's face it, is a fascinating thing to know about, and it deeply honors them. So without further ado, Amanda Fairbanks. Oh, and we have Morgan McGivern, who has compiled, he's sitting over there. He's a great photojournalist himself, and he has compiled a series of actual slides for us. I think this is such a treat. We're not going to be looking at a PowerPoint. We're going to be looking at projected slides. What? So get ready for that. And thank you for coming.
Thank you, April. It was beautiful. Thank you. I have mics, yeah. Wow, that was quite an introduction, April. Thank you. And thank you for inviting me to be in this beautiful, beautiful space. All right, so thank you all for taking the time on a Friday evening to be here and join me in this talk. So I usually read from my book, and I thought tonight I would do something a little bit different because I've recently written an essay that will appear this summer, will probably be edited and far better than this summer in a magazine that the East Hampton Star publishes called East. And my book actually should have been in East magazine, and then I never handed in the story, and I instead decided to write a book on it. So it's sort of a full circle situation. And the essay is called The Enduring Mystery of Scotty Clark. Exactly 5 years ago, I began gathering material for what started out as an assignment for a local magazine, but that eventually morphed into my first nonfiction book. The story centered around a tragedy that occurred off the coast of Montauk in late March of 1984. 4 young fishermen, Mike Stedman, Dave Connick, Michael Vigilant, and Scotty Clark, had been longlining for tilefish when their commercial fishing vessel, the Windblown, collided with an unpredicted early spring hurricane. Somewhere between Block Island and Montauk Point, gale force winds and 40-foot seas swallowed the crew whole. Neither the steel-hulled boat nor the bodies of the men were ever recovered. As I began the years-long research and reporting process, my naive assumption was that by the end of it, I would come to know the 4 men who were lost at sea in equal measure. Sadly, nothing wound up being farther from the truth. The men started out to me as blank silhouettes. Like sketch marks, every interview would fill in these tiny details until at last a human form started taking shape. But the version of who the men had been, their histories, their dreams, their heartaches, largely depended, of course, on who was alive and wanted to speak with me. Try as I might, the youngest of the foursome, Scotty Clark, remained an enigma. He was the outsider, the new kid in town. Shortly after the windblown went down, Scotty was the crew member whose last name all of the newspapers had gotten wrong. It was always Clark with an E, and he was only 18, not 19, as every news outlet from the New York Times to the East Hampton Star would wrongly report. While Captain Stedman and Dave Connick had long-standing ties to East Hampton, and Michael Vigilant, the son of a legendary commercial fisherman, had grown up in Montauk, Scotty was a relatively recent arrival, intent on developing a reputation around the docks as a reliable mate who wasn't afraid of a little hard work. So this past winter, I received a Facebook message from a woman called Denise Myers, who was one of Scotty's first cousins. She'd recently finished my book and was eager to share with me a little bit more about her cousin's backstory. Her mother, Xandra, and Scotty's mother, Donna, were sisters. Denise and Scotty, who were about 6 months apart, were raised less like cousins and more like siblings. Aunt Donna was a single mother who worked as an airline stewardess. When she was away on business, her extended family helped to raise and care for Scotty. As toddlers growing up in the outskirts of Clarksburg, West Virginia, one of their favorite games was to see how far they could unravel a spool of toilet paper before it broke in two. Come summertime, when they weren't learning how to swim, they disappeared together in the nearby woods, the ground blanketed in moss and rhododendrons, contentedly making caves until the sky grew dark. But a marked shift occurred in Scotty right around the time that his mother got together with a man called Tom Llewellyn. The family remembered Tom as cold and distant. Scotty refused to live with him under the same roof. After they married, the family moved to Oceanside, Long Island, and Denise and Scotty tried staying in touch, but back then, of course, long-distance calls were inordinately expensive. Around the age of 10, Scotty started running away from his stepfather, most especially. He soon found a kinship at the local docks where he baited hooks for commercial fishermen to earn extra money, and by 14, he dropped out of school and he left home for good. Donna was always a little off. Once her son was lost at sea, the lack of closure pushed her over the edge. Donna lived in the abyss, the black hole of losing a child. She never made it back up to the clear light of day. She believed that after the windblown went down, a Russian freighter had picked up her son. No amount of reasoning could persuade her otherwise. Donna, who worked for Trans World Airlines, put any extra airline miles she accumulated to use traveling the globe. She'd place missing posters in various exotic destinations. Her life depended on believing that her son, if only by the sheer force of a mother's will, would someday be found. People kept telling Donna some version of "you're crazy, he's dead, let it go." She paid them little mind. One time, the voices in her head told her that Scotty had purchased a home for her in the Midwest. So Donna got in her car, drove west, and promptly made herself at home. The people who actually owned the house were away on vacation, and when they came home, they realized soon that the woman living in their house wasn't exactly dangerous. To their astonishment, the house was actually far cleaner than when they had left, but they soon realized that she also wasn't all there. Other times, Donna had a habit of waving at planes flying overhead in the sky. When people asked her what she was doing, she explained that she was waving at Scotty. Her son was off saving the world. I'm almost done. Aunt Donna's fragile mental state soon divided her extended family into two warring factions. One side of the family wanted to simply leave her be, albeit with a bit more supervision, while the other side advocated that she be forcibly medicated and hospitalized. When I was finishing my book, I concluded that Donna had died of a broken heart. And I wasn't altogether wrong, but in talking with Denise, I learned that Donna had a sickness in her head that no amount of medicine could remedy. She was eventually diagnosed with schizophrenia and spent the rest of her life in and out of psychiatric care. In late July of 2010, Xandra paid her sister a visit to the Fairmont Medical Center in West Virginia, where she had been living for the past year. "He's really gone, isn't he?" Donna asked her. It had been 26 years since she last saw her son. "He was a good boy," Xandra answered back, "and he wouldn't have caused you this pain if he could have stopped it." Xandra watched as a sense of peacefulness, of grace, settled across her sister's anguished face. Donna was a devout Pentecostal. She prayed for hours each day. Death wasn't something to fear. Death was something to rejoice. A few days later, she went to meet her son. Now, in her 80s, Xandra ensures that flowers fill the 2 granite vases on either side of Scotty and Donna's joint headstone. Donna loved pretty, brightly colored flowers, so every season, her sister swaps out artificial bouquets. Earlier this month, to celebrate the arrival of spring, she planted yellow dahlias. I almost said daffodils. Okay, thank you for listening. So when we were organizing this talk, we were asked to provide a PowerPoint presentation, and Morgan, my friend sitting in the back, my photographer friend, we're both very low tech. So I brought my notebook, and he brought his slide projector with his slides from this era. So Morgan and I met years ago when we were both working at the East Hampton Star. We overlapped there for a couple of years. And this work that you're about to see essentially was part of his senior thesis when he was at Boston College. And the topic of his thesis was on commercial fishing. And Morgan was Dave Connick's best childhood friend. And the windblown went down in March of '84. And Morgan graduated from college in May of 1984. And so just a quick note, there are about 18 of his images scattered throughout my book if you've had the chance to take a look at it. But also included in this presentation are just other images from that era. So I hope you enjoy. I'm going to talk while you look at some pictures. Okay, so the backstory. I was sitting in the Star offices on Main Street in East Hampton, and it was the winter of 2016 when an editor by the name of Biddle Duke started talking to me about a new story. We were swapping story ideas, and he told me the story about the untold story of the Hamptons. And it was about class, and it was about surfing, and it was about fishing. And during the same conversation, he was going on and on and on about this fascinating woman called Mary Stedman. And the cadence of his voice shifted, and his eyes widened, and it was very, very clear that this story had struck a nerve. And I said, well, why is it that you don't want to write it? And he very quickly explained that he always thought an outsider to this community needed to come in and finally tell it, that an insider would be far too beholden to one particular version of the narrative in order to really, really do it justice. So my way into the story was through Mary Stedman, who's the widow of the young captain. She was 29 when her husband was lost at sea, and they had 3 young sons. And my husband and I relocated to Northern California in the fall of 2016. And that whole time we were there, that first year, there was just something about this story that I couldn't stop thinking about. That first summer, Mary didn't want to meet, and I reached out to her again when we would be back the following summer. And finally, she said the time was right to start meeting. So we had decided to meet at the East Hampton Library, and she kept canceling. And I feared that I would board the plane back to California and not have had the opportunity to finally meet her. But on my last day, I finally was able to sit down with her, and we talked for, 3.5, 4 hours. I very quickly discovered that she has this incredible gift of a photographic memory. And over the next few months, we would just spend hours and hours and hours on the phone. She could remember what kind of tea she was drinking, what the headlines in the New York Times were on a particular day in March of 1984 when she would lose her husband. So Mary would sort of pass me along to one source, followed by 5 more sources after that. And that fall, I decided, so this was the fall of 2017, I decided to take a reporting trip out to Montauk. And a friend of mine had joined me from the city, and she and I were sort of standing at the gates just as they were closing in this October kind of magical night. There was a lot of fog, and anyway, we're sort of asking to be let in. I had yet to see the Lost at Sea Memorial, which if you haven't had the opportunity to see, it's just beyond the lighthouse. I really can't recommend it enough. It's a very, very holy spot. And so we asked to be let in, and a woman that was coming out of the building said, you know, what is it that you're doing here? And I said, oh, well, I've come to research the windblown. And she said, oh, do you mean March 29th, 1984? And I said, why, yes, that is the date the boat went down. And it turns out there was a meeting of the Montauk Historical Society that was leaving, and the woman that I was talking to was the lighthouse keeper, and she started telling me about the bank she was working at when she first heard the news. And then another one of the gentlemen coming out of this building, out of this meeting rather, had gone to college with Mike Stedman, and he was telling me about the day he heard the news. And it was in that moment I realized that, of course, I knew that this trauma, this tragedy was hugely a part of the loved ones and survivors and friends. But it was at that moment I really was able to see how it was that in some ways this had become sort of this local 9/11, very, very local, hyper-local 9/11, in the sense that everyone could remember where they were when they first heard the news. This was an incredibly close-knit community, year-round community then, and this was just unimaginable that these 4 men would go missing in this storm. And you know, the other interesting piece was that, you know, if say you were living in West Hampton Beach, this would not have been something to concern yourself with. Again, this is just very, very specific to the East End and the South Forks especially. So during the same reporting trip, I was staying at a little cottage off of Old Montauk Highway, and no one was in sight, no one was in town. It's my favorite time of the year here in the fall. And I decided I wanted to go for a swim because we were living in Northern California, and you can't swim in the ocean in Northern California, it's too cold. And so I went for a swim, and I brought my, you know, little towel from the room, and I, you know, put it down in the sand, and no one was on the beach. There wasn't a soul in sight. Got into the water, got out of the water, put my towel around me, and lo and behold, there's this shell sitting next to my towel, right next to my towel. And it wasn't just an ordinary shell, you know, it looks, you probably can't see it, but it has all these different sort of colors on it. And then on the back of the shell, it says, "Forever in our hearts." Kind of interesting. So I put that into my suitcase, and I flew back to California. And in one of my next conversations, I said to Mary that after this trip, I felt like I really wanted to try and write a book about this, and not just a magazine story. And she said, well, of course, Amanda, of course you're going to write a book about this. I've always known that. I was just waiting for you to figure that out. And then I told her about the shell, and she felt as though it was just yet this other sign that this random woman from Southern California who was 4 years old when this tragedy occurred had somehow maybe been given some type of permission to finally tell this story in the fullness and the richness that it had always deserved. So I don't know, maybe that sounds like complete lunacy to you, but it felt very meaningful to me. So in January of 2018, I sold a book proposal to my editor, and the book was called The Windblown, which has subsequently, of course, become The Lost Boys of Montauk. And this was only based on a few months of reporting. It was a sample chapter, an outline, and essentially just this first tiny layer of work. And so over 2 years later, over 100 interviews, these are dozens of people I spent hours and hours with at a time. Such a different animal than writing a newspaper story. A half dozen FOIA requests. I finally realized this tragedy sort of stood for this whole secret world, and buried beneath this relatively straightforward fishing tragedy were all of these really fascinating layers. And these certain themes started to emerge from the material. These universal themes that I found so moving. So this dynamic, this very, very fraught dynamic between fathers and sons. So all of these 4 men, 4 boys, they were 18, 19, 23, and 32. all had very, very fraught relationships with their fathers, whether their fathers had been an alcoholic or absent. In the case of one of the young fishermen, his father had actually already died at sea. There was also, of course, this very interesting dynamic, which we all know here, between the locals and the summer people. And Dave Connick, one of the beautiful young men on the boat, was a Maidstone Club member. And it was pretty unthinkable that a Maidstone Club kid would leave Friends Seminary and hightail it out to Montauk and become a commercial fisherman. Obviously, the themes of grief and loss and secrets and lies emerged, and the different coping mechanisms that all of the survivors would come to rely upon, whether it looked like denial or drug and alcohol addiction. Also, a search for identity was a huge piece of this work, and also paternity and what it means to be a father. So this will come as a huge shock, but I am neither, just as April was saying, Nathaniel Philbrick nor Sebastian Junger. And I think when people see the cover of the book, those are phenomenal writers, by the way. And if you want to read The Perfect Storm, you should absolutely read The Perfect Storm. But I think when people see my book, they expect it to be this action story that unfolds at sea, and we never get off the boat. And that's just not the book that I was interested in writing. And I think all along, even though I didn't really know it at the outset, the real draw for me was this psychological pull among the survivors, who were really the women who were left behind, whether it was Mary, who was the captain's wife, whether it was Alice and Maud and Donna, who were the mothers, and the girlfriends, of course. We get to know Nana and Kim. And it was interesting because I would obviously speak to so many of their friends, but it wasn't until I was able to sit down with the mothers and with Mary, of course, and with the girlfriends that these men came into just very, very, very sharp focus, with, of course, the exception of Scott Clark. The other thing that I did in the book that some people quite dislike is this sort of insider-outsider situation. And I did something in the book that I will never do in another book again, which is I insert myself as this very minor, totally irrelevant character. But I'm not this huge narcissist, I swear to you, but it was a way of explaining how it was that such an outsider came to learn of such a closely held insider story. And as we know, this is such a unique place, right? Because you have to be here for so long in order to say that you're from here, which is another really interesting piece of this local versus summer population in terms of the dichotomy of that. But also the insider-outsider piece was that I needed to kind of differentiate myself as the storyteller, and that I'm not an authorized biographer, and that this is simply my accounting of what happened. And I guess that shortly before the book came out, and I realized that this would certainly ruffle more than a few feathers, some of the material that's in the book, I realized that all of the living characters would have written really different stories, right? They would each have a different version of their book and their story. And I've also, as you may or may not know, I've been on the receiving end of not an insignificant amount of pushback. And a lot of the time it's felt sort of a bit like, who does this woman, this outsider who's not from here, think she is to come along and to tell this story? And a lot of times it's felt as though I was sort of supposed to stick to a particular script or a prescribed version of the narrative that everyone might have felt more comfortable with. I'm not quite sure. And then the next piece I wanted to share with you is that I'm going to work on a new book project. I have a new editor at St. Martin's Press, and it's going to be called The Last Aristocrats. And this is about the 400-year history of Gardiner's Island. And then I will never write about Long Island ever again, ever again. Just fascinating, obviously, history, and there's such a lot of history there. But Lion Gardiner founded it as his own in 1639, which was 137 years before the founding of the United States. It's the largest privately held island in America. And it's a really fascinating family because it's been handed down. It's now in its 17th generation. And the Gardiners are just one of the most remarkable families. If you think of the Gilded Age families and whose fortunes have long since evaporated, well, theirs is quite doing quite well. And one of my focuses, at least initially, will be on the Gardner women who have been little documented. There was this incredible First Lady Julia Gardner Tyler. There was a woman called Elizabeth Gardner Howell who was actually on trial just before the Salem witch trials for witchcraft in East Hampton. She was very, very feared. And then, of course, there's the current heiress, Alexandra Creel Gillette, and she is a lifelong environmentalist and conservationist, and she formerly attended the Yale School of Forestry. And now I'm in the process of trying to convince the Gillettes to sit down with me, which may or may not happen, which is the work that I get to do. And one last bit of just really interesting news that I'd love to share with you, and then I'll open it up to questions. When the book came out last summer, there was a gentleman that came to my talk at Guildhall who is a television producer, and over the course of the next few months, he wound up acquiring the rights to my book. And just about 2 weeks ago, Hulu has decided to greenlight a pilot for a television series, which doesn't mean it's going to ever happen, because that's how Hollywood works. But he's attached this really brilliant showrunner called Craig Wright, who's a former playwright. He worked on 6 Feet Under, and he's brilliant. And it's just been so interesting to have gotten to write the book that I wanted to write about this story, and to now see someone else tell a totally different version of it, what the story is of Mike and Dave and Michael and Scotty in a completely different form. And so that's just really kind of amazing to get to watch and to be a part of course. I'm a big part of it. So yeah, I'm going to leave it at that. And I'd love to take your questions. And obviously we have Morgan here to answer questions as well. So yes, please.
I know this is probably not your focus in the book, and I haven't read it, but I'm familiar with The Perfect Storm, and the sailors, or whatever you want to tag the fishermen on The Perfect Storm, they were going for in contrast, in The Perfect Storm, they were going for extended period of time. And so it was inherently risky because given the fast changing of weather conditions, you never could be assured of safe passage. So that was always a mission that had some risk. I don't know, but in this case, was this a day trip?
No. So that's an interesting question. This wasn't a day trip. This was an unforecasted hurricane, and the entire fleet of Montauk made it in just in the nick of time, except for this boat. So about 1975 to 1985 was this really interesting window, which was kind of the golden era of tile fishing, of long lining for tile fish, which you do 100, 200 miles offshore, where not a speck of land can be seen. And these guys were catching, 40-pound tile fish, tens of thousands of pounds, and they were out for between 5 to 7 days at a time. Obviously, the weather forecasting wasn't nearly what it is today, so they stayed out too long. They were catching too much fish. No one really knows why it is that they made it back, as late as they did. So yes, unlike the Perfect Storm story, they weren't sword fishing. They weren't out for a month or what have you, but they were out for about a week. Yeah.
I enjoyed the book very much.
Thank you.
But one thing puzzled me. Stedman, who was about 32, you said?
Yes.
And had been a commercial fisherman for a pretty long time. There seemed to be a lot of agreement that the boat he bought, was not seaworthy.
Correct.
Now, do you think that's a rationalization after the event, or was that something that people felt at the time? And if it was something people felt at the time, why did you buy the boat?
It's an interesting question. I'll never really know the answer to that question, but obviously I've spent a lot of time thinking about that and talking about that to people that knew him and that were members of the fleet, some of whom shared with me very, very clearly that they thought it was a terrible idea. And I think afterwards a lot of them felt quite a bit of regret that they hadn't gone up to him and said, what the hell are you thinking? This boat is clearly not seaworthy. I think Mike was doing the best he could. This was his first boat. Again, he was 32 years old. He had to take out a second mortgage on his house. He had 3 kids to feed. He had a young wife. He had the pressure of the world on him. And for whatever reason, he decided to buy this boat in Texas. We do happen to live on Long Island. There are a lot of boats nearby. But an interesting interpretation of this that his son actually recently shared with me a few months ago, Chris, his eldest son, was that in thinking about the last few months of his father's life and his decision making, his decision to get the boat and then a whole bunch of other things that we learn about in the book, he feels as though his father had a sense that things were not as they appeared in his marriage, in his family life, that there was this deep heartache, really, unresolved heartache, and that it sort of led him to these series of catastrophic decisions toward the end of his life, which of course was part of the decision making to be out as long, in the storm as long as he was. And he doesn't mean it to say that there was any type of conscious decision, that he had a type of death wish, or God forbid, would take out, these 3 friends of his, not in the slightest. But that there was a degree of unconsciousness happening, that there was some sense that things were not right. And as such, he wasn't in his right mind totally. So, but again, I will never know the answer to that. Thank you for that question. In the back of the room.
The pushback that you got after the book was written from the small community that was affected, did you sense that when you were doing the interviews in the process of writing the book?
Yes, I absolutely did. I might have had a little bit of a nervous breakdown after I handed in the first draft, which my husband, who's in the back row, will attest to. There were many, many versions of the story that I could have written, and I could have just written that, clean version that maybe everyone would have been really happy about and happy with me. I'm really, really happy I wrote this book in my early 40s instead of my early 30s, because I wouldn't have had nearly a thick enough skin to deal with some of the hostility and criticism. But yes, as soon as we got to these family secrets and what to include and what not to include, I knew that I would be ruffling a lot of feathers. And it's kind of the work that I do. Sometimes, but yeah, I did know that, and I really did wrestle with what to keep in, what to keep out, and this is actually sort of the PG version of what happened in many ways, and also if I didn't include all these layers that I had found so fascinating, what was I doing with my time, and that ultimately the thing that I won't spoil it if you haven't finished the book, but if the end of the book has to do with the whole theme of this father and son dynamic, right? So, to me, how dare I not put it in? Since I'm a journalist and I write nonfiction, and everything I write is true. So yes, but I wrestled with that a lot. Yes.
Amanda, I wish.
Sorry, and then you.
I'm sorry.
No.
I wish you could read something, only because there's a certain time that you were describing, and tell me if I'm wrong as I remember it. You so beautifully described when there was awareness, and maybe it was your awareness when something really clicked for you about what this story meant, and the loss and the grief, but the insider-outsider aspect. Do you feel you ever really got the Maidstone people?
No, never.
You do not?
Never, yeah.
They and the children are now talking? I mean, they call it Mike's kids?
I think it's a very complicated relationship.
It's very complicated.
Because there are 3 sons. 2 of the 3 sons did not want to speak to me, didn't want this book written. It's a different.
Well, I have to say,
dynamic.
it's very dramatic. It's a very dramatic story. However the producers decide to take it, I know it's letting your baby go. So.
Yeah, we'll see. As you know, nothing gets made in Hollywood, so
yeah.
I'm gonna write a book.
Thank you for writing the story.
Oh, thank you, Barbara. Thank you for all of your support. I really appreciate it. Barbara's a TV woman among other talents. Yes.
I haven't read the book, but were you able to research anything through their yearbooks in their schools about
I did.
what may have been written about these young kids?
I did. I found the yearbooks both for Dave Connick and for Michael Stedman, which was so interesting because he was on every sporting group imaginable. He was, this incredibly good-looking, popular, charismatic, life of the party guy, which was evident on many, many pages of his yearbook. So that was a really interesting time capsule with which to see, again, they were so young, so it's not as though I could see their arc of their lives. But yes, that particular window was very interesting. Any reason why you asked in particular?
Curious.
Just curious, okay.
Yeah, you mentioned at the beginning that it is working, that they were part of the surf culture out there as well. I'm afraid I haven't read the book yet. I'm waiting for April to finish it, but
April, you gotta finish it.
Yeah, no, I know. But I'm curious as to whether the book goes into any kind of details that might have fed into an understanding of who the boys were and in terms of the surf culture.
Yes, of course. So it's another huge piece of this world that I knew nothing about. So I had to become an expert at the Maidstone Club, which didn't exactly open their doors for me. And commercial fishing and golden tilefish. I know a heck of a lot about golden tilefish, if you ever want to chat about that. And then, of course, surfing, which I'm not a surfer. So I do go into just that whole arc of what it meant to, say, grow up, on the western end of Long Island, Up Island, as we would say, and what it was that meant what drew this whole generation to Montauk, right? These were surfers, they were carpenters to make a living, or they were waiting tables, or they were commercial fishermen. But certainly the huge bond that Michael Stedman and Dave Connick shared was surfing. There's a whole nother subset of Montauk fishermen who don't swim and think that, why would you ever want to go anywhere near the water if you're not making a living from it? And so that was part of that divide as well. But no, that's a huge piece of certain aspects of the book, is the surfing and that whole brotherhood. And when Ditch Plains wasn't filled with, Range Rover driving moms dropping their kids off for surf camp and other horrifying 21st century behaviors.
If you could, I'm sorry. I was just going to follow up with a question
please.
about whether if you could summarize the ethos of the surfing culture, how would you do that?
Well, to me, it felt a whole lot like rebellion and, pushing away from the version of life that their fathers had wanted them maybe to lead. A lot of the men in my book, their fathers were, stockbrokers and lawyers, and Michael Stedman's father had been a lifelong diplomat with the United Nations. And I think all of that, the idea that you would live your life in a cubicle and have a secretary and put on a suit and tie every day, nothing could have been less interesting to them. Obviously this is the era of the Vietnam War. There was just a lot of social upheaval, and I think from speaking with some of the men that were there, Montauk felt like a really great place to drop out of all of that. If you weren't going to go to Malibu, you'd be at Ditch, and you'd be sort of forming this whole new community. And nearly everyone describes it as really the best time of their lives. I don't know if it's the fact that it's their late teens and 20s that we often think that way of, but it sounded like a very, very special time. I wish I had been there.
I wanted to ask, you were, as I was reading the book, I kept being surprised, because I really didn't guess what the trajectory was exactly. But I kept being surprised at the way you were digging into people's lives and their psychological motivations. And I started to feel a little bit like I felt looking at some of my husband's paintings, especially early paintings, which oftentimes involve suburban dramas, the underbelly of the supposedly perfect suburban lifestyle, the two kids in the perfect house and daddy goes
all
to
a
work
facade.
and daddy comes home. Yeah, and then all of a sudden there's the alcoholic mother, and then there's the deeply unhappy whatever, and then there's the 30-year affair that is revealed to the kids when they're grown up. I mean, all of those things were shown in your book. I think that's one of the reasons that I would call it a brave book. Have you maintained relationships with people whom you interviewed, like Mary Stedman and everyone, after the book was published? Were there any big ruptures? I hope you don't mind me asking
Oh, no,
this.
of
I'm
course
just
not.
deeply
Everyone
curious.
always asks me that, and it's a great question. Not that whole, I loved what you mentioned about things essentially not being as they appear, right? Which is our great conundrum. And yes, there was a lot of suffering in all of the families, and all of our families, right? When we tell the truth about what's really occurring. Obviously, there's a lot of different gray areas in each of our stories and backstories. But yes, it was a really unique experience for me. I normally would interview someone once or twice for a story and move on. And this was a way in which I was able to get to know people over a period of years. And as we know, we reveal ourselves in these layers, right? And when we first meet someone, there's this kind of superficial layer, and then maybe we see them 5 times after that, and a little bit more gets revealed. And there was this give and take, right? Mary got to know a lot about me, and I got to know a lot about her, and we shared a lot of things in common at the time. And then as the story went along, and her son called me and said, "Has Mary told you the secret in the story yet?" Which I won't share the secret. And I said, well, this is my first time talking to her son. I said, well, Mary has shared a bunch of things with me that are off the record and that I will never speak of. So, kind of pushing back on that. And then he shared with me the secret. Then I looped back around with Mary and I said, it would seem as though you might have left out a pretty big piece of this story, given that we're kind of 2 years into this excavation of your whole life. And, initially we had this very fraught encounter, and then eventually she felt as though it had just gotten totally out of control, and we stopped speaking, and we are not in touch, which I understand. And I actually think that there had to be some separation between she and I for me to write the book, because I always knew that, it was way before I knew any, the layers of detail here, I knew I would describe something about her that it would invariably evoke a terrible reaction. She's just a really, really complicated person. But if at the outset when we met, she had set these boundaries and said, hey, please write this story about my husband and my family, but this part you cannot put in, okay? Like, here are the boundaries, and there are these very clear boundaries. Of course, but I think in the kind of work that I do, when you kind of come at it the other way, then you create this dynamic where it's sort of as though neither party trusts the other anymore, if that makes any sense.
It does. And
everyone else is talking to me, though. Well, not everyone else, but I don't want to spoil it for you, April.
That's all right. One of the reasons that I'm asking is that as I've been reading it, I've been thinking about all of these boys, young men, were in some cases almost addicted to, and in other cases bravely standing for a kind of counterculture lifestyle, opposite
Yes.
of their fathers, opposite of what society expected of them, opposite. So, and their wives were very much the same, and Mary seemed like the most radical of the wives, the most kind of headstrong, the most kind of internally intact and but just strong. I mean, just,
Yeah.
with her psychic, abilities or whatever. But then there comes a point where, of course, when you're sharing things, the one trap door that I think you will keep closed are things that give you too much pain, or you don't know how to deal with them. And no matter how brave and radical you might want to be within your life choices and behavior, it doesn't necessarily extend to speech and sharing and feeling like everything about you is okay.
Of course.
So it's very interesting that I just kept thinking as I was reading it about how that kind of choice of lifestyle and a certain kind of personal radicalism does not necessarily extend to a public kind of persona that you're willing to. Do you know what I'm saying? It's kind of hard to describe, but.
Her many, 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 many layers. I mean, what a fascinating woman. Brilliant, and I've often felt about Mary that she came from a great deal of family dysfunction herself. Alcoholism is a theme that runs through each of the families, as it does through my family, and I just think that had she had a mother figure that maybe had pushed her a little more forcibly, right, to maybe get the heck out of here for a little while, and do something else with her life. Not that she shouldn't have had 3 children when she was 19 and fallen in love with Mike Stedman, but there was always the sense that she could have done just something a little bit, maybe not more with her life, but there was this great untapped intellect and talent and just voracious appetite for learning, and we discussed that as well. Yeah. Thank you, April. So many good questions. So cozy in here. It's raining. I didn't even know it was going to be raining.
I'd love to hear from Morgan, if he would like to just say a few words about showing the slides and how it feels for him to be working with you in this talk.
I can't believe how well they're projected. These have been projected in public once before, and then the last time I projected them to a group of more than 4 was the second floor at the Boston College Fine Arts Building, next to the law school in Newton, Connecticut. I'm sure a lot of you have been through that territory. And they've never been projected at this size, so I can't believe they're holding together. Thanks to Tom, who designed this. I came in this afternoon at 12, and he coaxed me into the larger position of projection. And I'm thrilled that they're up on the screen. My perspective is quite different than Amanda's. It all seems totally normal to me, not really a counterculture lifestyle.
Morgan's also an amazing surfer.
Microphone? I don't think I've ever held a microphone in my hand like this, but there's always a first. My father wrote speeches, was a well-known speechwriter and a jurist, and I watched him write speeches throughout my childhood. That's another story. I think it's better just to let Amanda do her before I have to take the 5th.
No, Morgan's
Or the
amazing.
6th.
Yes, one other thing, just tag on Rachel's, and I'll get to your question, on April's question, was just that another interesting piece about this interview process, of course with Mary, of course with Chris, of course with Pete Connick, of course with so many of the main living characters, was that, which I did not know going into this, was that in discussing with them in such detail the major trauma of their lives, the sediment came back up from the surface. They were reliving the trauma in many, many ways. And Mary in particular, so, with our minds and trauma, you either, block everything out and you have no recollection of what occurred, or like Mary, you remember everything in this very, very, very minute detail. And so that was another just really interesting part of the process, where I think when she and I began talking, neither of us knew that it would have that effect necessarily. Does that, of this sort of ricochet effect? Anyway, it's an aside. Yes, please, your question.
First, I enjoyed your book a lot.
Thank you.
And I'm very familiar with Montauk. I had a studio out there 20 years ago. And I listened to your book on trips to Montauk. I have it as an audiobook.
Oh, wow.
And is the narrator, is that you?
It is not me.
Ah,
Yeah,
that was
she's a professional book reader, which is a thing.
Yeah.
No, it's not me. It was during COVID, and I guess if you are not a famous person, you have to go in and for 2 weeks and sit in a sound booth and re-record every single sentence because you don't know what you're doing. And so I elected to not do that. And I was choosing between 2 men and 2 women, and of course, how could I have a man read this book? That sounds terrible. So I chose one of the women kind of randomly.
Yeah, it was very well read.
You liked? Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Anyone else in the back row over there? No, just kidding. Last question, anyone?
Simple question.
Okay, Barbara, please.
Only because my husband asked me, and I'm sorry because I read the book. Okay. You express very clearly that his friends, I believe in the book, some of them were appalled when he went down and got this boat and jerry-rigged what was called the top.
Right.
And tell the people what his one friend, underneath his breath, said the boat should be called.
Oh, so the boat was called, the Windblown was the name of the boat that he inherited. He intended to rename it. But if you turn the W upside down, it would be the Mind Blown, which is kind of funny.
And that is because of how he jerry-rigged the boat and
Yes.
said it was not seaworthy.
Well, and it had a wooden pilot house. It had a steel hull. I mean, keep in mind, these guys were not driving yachts around. I mean, they were
That's
all
right.
hustling to have vessels of their own and not have to pay, the owner half of their catch.
So as we read this story and that moment when they were out there, here's what I couldn't answer,
Yeah,
Steve.
yeah.
What was the communication process at that point? Because at some point, the very good friend said, he's only an hour behind me. He came into port and said, they're only an hour behind.
Right.
Now, is it in that hour that the wind took them away, or no one really knows?
We
What
don't
was
really
the
know.
communication?
We don't know the last minutes and seconds. He phoned a friend of his at 2 a.m, and then he spoke to him again at 7 that morning on the 29th of March. And at 2 a.m, he was describing these hellacious conditions, but sounded okay, as okay as one could be in a 60-foot boat with 40-foot seas and 100-mile-an-hour winds. But then by 7 a.m., there was a sound in his voice, in his friend's voice, he had never heard before. And it was just sheer terror. And he said, please tell my wife I love her. And that was the last time that, according to my reporting, according to all of the people I was able to interview, that was the last person that heard his voice and what he said.
Thank
So,
you.
Yeah. Yes, please.
This may have been revealed in the book, and again, I haven't read the book, but was Mary or any of the boys, were they aware of the fact that some felt that the boat was not necessarily seaworthy?
Yes, I think that was a widely held view of it.
And Mary knew that.
Mary was against the boat from the moment she saw it in the newspaper ad when he was sitting on his couch with a beer in their house in the Northwest Woods on Stevenhams Path. She had no idea. She pleaded with her husband not to get the boat. She
And the
thought he
boys
was,
knew too.
well, the boys were too young. They would have been 8 and 6.
No, not her boys.
Oh, not her boy. Oh, no. I think his mates.
But there, how many young
Well, it was a dream, right? He had been a captain on all of these men's boats his whole life. He was breaking free. He was going to buy his own boat. It was a momentous occasion, and of course, it wasn't a brand new perfect boat. He couldn't have ever afforded that. And all of his friends went down to Texas with him, and they drove the boat back up here, and they were planning to do a whole bunch of different work to it that summer once they had paid his insurance and his mortgage and all of that kind of stuff. So no, there wasn't a sense that there was a sense that the construction is a little particular, a little unique, but I think a lot of his close friends had his back.
So the boys knew to some degree that it was risky.
I mean, commercial fishing is the deadliest profession. It's very, very risky, yeah, even when you're on a great boat.
I absolutely love the book.
Oh,
I
I
wanted
paid
to
all
take
these
my
people to say
time.
that. I have them
I
scattered
wanted
throughout
to
the
take
room.
my time and finish it. I loved it so much.
Thank you.
I kept thinking as I was reading, how much research did you put in? How many interviews? How many months? How many years?
Too much.
From beginning to end, because it was so impressive
Thank you.
that you
Yeah.
really dug deep into the truth. And I was just curious how much, it seemed like a lot of work to me.
It was a lot of work. It was an obsession. It was a total obsession. And I don't know, it's the first book I've written. I don't know if I'll feel that way about something else I do again. Hopefully I will. It's a wonderful feeling. But yeah, I had never written a book before. So I was like, I'm not an artist, but it was like throwing paint at a canvas and, I didn't know when to stop. I don't know when to stop learning about grief and loss and trauma and family dynamics and inherited generational loss and, I mean, God, so many topics: the surfing, the fishing, the topography, this dynamic between the silent generation and the baby boomers, and it was too much. And my poor husband, I remember one time very clearly in our office, we have a joint office, and I did like a Carrie Matheson Homeland situation where there was like a chart and then all these little things going off diagonally. And I think his coworkers thought that I had lost my damn mind. And I very nearly did. And the structuring of the book was so hard, and so many people don't like the structure. And I hear you. It was confounding. It was like a jigsaw puzzle that could still be reordered in a better way. It's not chronological. The drama of the boat isn't like, it was very, very tricky to figure out when to put what where. And the project I'm working on now, thankfully, praise the Lord, is much more chronological. But yeah, thank you. I really appreciate you for getting that.
I love the structure.
Thank you.
I would think the structure would lend itself to the not knowing.
Yeah, it kind of like
Piecing it
jags
together.
around, yeah. Which I love that about nonfiction, but I occasionally have a terrible habit of reading online reviews, which you should never do. And not everyone feels that way, so.
I thought that also, that we felt like we were discovering it with you as we read it, because
Yeah,
I felt like in line with you, so.
It unfolds.
Yes, it unfolds as you were gathering your information and telling the story.
thank you.
Sharing
That's
that with
very
us.
kind of you. Thank you. Yes.
Did Mary ever confide in you if her life had taken another direction, what she could have been?
Well, she was actually an amazing photographer. And for a number of years, she worked at the Southampton Press. And she was is a mystic, and studies all these different religions, and is really, I think, at her core, an artist. I think she would have loved to have written. Yeah, I don't know. Yes.
I loved your book. I read it last year, so I don't remember the important details. But one thing that I heard about in the book for the first time was tilefish, because I never had heard of that before, and that it was such a big money maker. Was really curious. Now is that still going on, do you know?
Tile fishing is still going on. Yes, there are 2 boats left in all of Montauk Harbor that still tile fish, and they do a week on and a week off. And this lovely woman in the front row, my friend Erica, her brother actually, Brian, shared with me in the early stage part of the research process, there's this term, which I include in the book, and it's fascinating. It's called shifting baseline syndrome, which is a really interesting environmental term, which is essentially how it was that this generation of fishermen were used to catching a tilefish that was, 35 pounds or 40 pounds, and how, say, a modern day fisherman sees the tilefish are 3 to 5 pounds or 2 to 4 pounds, and that becomes normal, right? That if there's not this yardstick between generations, whatever you're catching seems normal. So yes, I learned a lot about golden tilefish. They used to be much more popular, although I see them now on the menu. I think I have a tendency to just search out golden tilefish.
Have you tried it?
Yeah. Oh yeah, it's delicious. It's really, really yummy.
I understood that motivation, even that they're only out there for 5 or 7 days, and they could make quite a bit of money.
So much money. If it went well, they were making so much money. Yeah.
Especially for younger
And they
people.
were working 20 hours a day. I mean, they were killing themselves. Yeah. By the end, they were just they had nothing left every single time. Yeah. Anyone else? And then I'll let you go and enjoy the rest of your evening.
I just, on the subject of tilefish, I'm so glad you brought that up, because shifting baseline syndrome is so interesting, because it has, in the book, you say that it has led to the perception on the part of fishermen that it's normal for certain years to be boom years for fish populations, and that it's equally normal within 10 years or 20 years for there to be a dearth of the same previously populous fish numbers.
Right.
And that coupled with the National Marine Fisheries Service trying to protect fish, protect the species, protect quotas, and protect the fishermen ultimately, has led to a huge amount of stress because of a perception that they've inherited really from generations of fishermen who feel that that's a norm. And I thought that was a very interesting thing to point out, because clearly there's a culture and a way of thinking and pride and a knowledge that goes with that pride that you don't want to mess with. I mean, it's rude to not really try to understand another culture. And the people out there that work that hard and have that ethos obviously are preserving a certain kind of not only their businesses, but a way of life that they deeply believe in. And I felt it was very poignant and very smart that you pointed that out. But it was very poignant to think about now, and catching a fish that's 5 pounds instead of 50 pounds.
Fascinating,
which is
right?
really amazing. And also, just for something to look forward to, tilefish burrow into the deepest canyons of the ocean, hundreds of feet down, and they actually build little cities and what they call pueblos.
You won the award for the closest reader, April.
Yeah, but I love nature stuff, so I was fascinated, and now, alarmingly, there seem to be a lot of abandoned burrows, but I thought, well, maybe it's just the way that this is a natural pattern. I don't know, and scientists don't know. I know you could liken it to our own psychology. It's the things that we think we know and we don't know about ourselves.
And historically, ocean populations, apparently, the little I know about it, I'm hardly an expert in this topic at least, they wax and wane through different decades and seasons, and it's not all entire. And the quota system is hugely fraught for fishermen in Montauk. They're barely making a living, and that's a whole nother aside. I just wanted to thank you so much for being here tonight. Thank you so much. Such a pleasure. Thank you all. Thank you.